I would like to invite you to take your Bibles and join me in Genesis chapter 9. Genesis 9, we're going to be covering verses 18 through 29. We're going to finish the chapter this morning, Lord willing, and you can find that text beginning on page 7 in the blue ESV Bible in the seat backs out there, if that is the text you're using. Page 7 in that, Genesis 9, 18 through 29. Title of our sermon is Curse. We have been in Genesis for most of this year, and for the past several weeks, even a couple of months, we've been looking at Genesis 6 through 9. And so far in our trek through this book, we have seen God's creation of the heavens and the earth, and then we saw what became of the heavens and the earth with the fall of the first man, Adam, in the Garden of Eden. We then saw what became of Adam with the death of Adam and the eventual deaths of each of his descendants down through Noah, who for the past couple of months we've been considering Noah and what became of Noah. This section, Genesis 6, 9 through 9:29, presents us with the main idea found in chapter 8, verse 1. We read of God's gracious covenantal act of remembrance that He bestowed upon Noah. He remembered Noah while he was on the ark. Noah, through whom He had promised to preserve a remnant of the world. Now this passage, 6:9 through 9:29, it builds to that moment in 8:1 with the decreation of the world through a catastrophic flood that killed everything on the land. And it builds out from that moment in 8:1. It builds out from that moment by God's recreation of the world, His blessing of Noah and his sons, whom He had saved through the ark, calling them to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, in the hopes of the covenantal provisions made whereby He promised never to destroy every living thing again on the earth by means of a flood. And this third major section of Genesis, following the introduction, it ends with this enigmatic passage with Noah and his sons. It's a tension-filled climax, and it has left many Bible readers scratching their heads. Because as you read Genesis 6:9 and following, you could be easily forgiven for thinking that Noah was the promised seed of the woman from Genesis 3:15. He was the one born to crush the head of the serpent. He was the one to bring relief from the pain and the curse on the ground. Right? We have the hope-filled name given to him by his father. Noah sounds like the Hebrew word for rest. We have his righteous and blameless character attributed to him prior to the flood. He receives nearly the same commission that Adam had been given in the Garden of Eden. He is a new Adam. He is a new head of humanity. He has nearly all the markers one might expect of humanity's hero. Could he be the one, the champion God has given to do battle against the evil one and to rescue us from our sins? Well, today's passage affirms two very important truths in light of that question. One, Noah is not our guy. But two, it is through Noah and his offspring, one of his sons in particular, that the promised seed shall come. Now, if you aren't familiar with this passage, I'm going to read it in a moment. It's not exactly for the faint of heart. The Bible doesn't shy away from discussing what you might call seedy material, but it never presents it gratuitously. our passage today, while in describing the sins that occur here, it's rather brief, terse. The interpretations of what's going on here can touch on some rather uncomfortable topics. And so I'm going to be as discreet as I can be, but parents of young children in particular, you might appreciate a heads up. It's about to get real. So let me read this passage, verses 18 through 29, and then I'll outline the sermon, and we'll get to work on it. Our text reads, The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the vineyard, a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. We're going to break this text up into 4 parts. We're going to make 4 observations from this passage, the middle 2 being the most prominent. First, in verses 18 and 19, we see that Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are responsible for repopulating the earth in this now post-Diluvian world. Second, verses 20 through 23, we are confronted by Noah's rather shocking debauchery, along with his sons' varied responses to their father's failure. Third, verses 24 to 27, we hear Noah's declaration of curses and commendations for his 3 sons, and especially their posterity. And finally, we come to the end of this section of Genesis with Noah's death. So that's kind of a lot in short. We're going to observe Noah's descendants, his debauchery, his declarations, and his death. And all of it, remember, is in service of this main point of the passage, that although Noah is not the promised seed, the expectation and the hope for redemption and conflict remains in Noah's children and beyond. So consider with me in the first place, verses 18 and 19, where we see once again that Noah has 3 sons. This is, by my count, the 4th time in this section that we are told that Noah has 3 sons and that their names are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And all 4 times, this is the order given, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And all of this becomes something of a point of contention for some who see this as a bit of a contradiction with what is said in verse 24, that Ham is Noah's youngest son. In all 4 listings, Ham is named second rather than third, as you might expect of the youngest of 3. Now, while it would make sense to name Noah's sons in order of their birth, there's not necessarily any reason to insist that this is the governing feature of the author here, that this is what he is in fact doing in naming Noah's sons in this way. In fact, in chapter 10, the order of the list, Shem, Ham, Japheth, is changed in the order of the genealogies, given that we will see, Lord willing, next week. Japheth is named first. Well, the list a 5th time is given at the first part of chapter 10. And then in the genealogy, Japheth comes first, and then Ham and Shem comes last. In that case, Shem is mentioned, it seems, because it is through Shem that we will find out that it is his line that will continue on with the promised seed. In Genesis, the dead-end genealogies are always mentioned first, and they give way to the continuing chosen line of the promised seed. We saw that, for example, in Genesis 4 and 5. We have Cain's genealogy given, and then we have Seth's. And here in chapter 10:21, there's an interpretive issue that could go either way regarding the birth order of Shem and Japheth. Most modern translations, the ESV included, has Shem as the oldest. Some have Japheth as the oldest. Either way, Shem or Japheth is the oldest, and it's quite clear that Ham is the youngest. And so the order in this, the giving of these names, rather than being chronological, it has to do with probably what sounded best. Shem, Japheth, and Ham, or Japheth, Shem, and Ham, is just slightly harder to say than Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so this likely is the reason given, why they're listed in this order of Noah's sons. In short pairs and list, it's often shorter words and names that are put forth for ease of communication. And again, I bring that up primarily because of the way that people read verse 24 and then assume that there's a contradiction here or that these are coming from two wildly different sources. But the point in naming the men here, Noah's sons in 18 and 19, is that it is from these men and their wives that the entire earth is to be populated through the dispersion of their descendants. And so really these two verses serve as a preparatory statement that shall be further considered and explained in the next section, which we'll consider in chapters 10 and 11. So really just under this first point, we need to see that Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and in particular, Ham had a son named Canaan. And so secondly, we come to Noah's debauchery in verses 20 through 23, and his sons' responses to it. Now, there are three angles that we need to consider, three angles to this scene. The first is the Noah angle. Second, we'll consider the Ham angle, and third, Shem and Japheth angle. First, we're told that Noah began to be a man of the soil. Genesis, the book of beginnings, it relays to its readers several beginnings, in fact. The word translated here as began in 9:20, it occurs in a few other places in the opening chapters of Genesis. We find it first in 4:29. After the birth of Enosh, man began to call upon the name of the Lord. We see it again in chapter 6, verse 1. Man began to multiply on the face of the earth. We have it here in 9:20. Noah began to be a man of the soil or the land. We see it next in 10:4. Nimrod was the first, same word, to become a mighty hunter against the Lord. And then again in 11:6. When God sees the tower that Nimrod's descendants build, he says this is only the beginning of what they will do. And so the point in mentioning these different passages is that while the word's use in 4:29 is seemingly positive, the other uses of the word indicate rather ominous beginnings. If you know anything about how those stories unfold, which we haven't gotten to two of them yet, but let's see how it goes here in chapter 9. We're told that Noah began to be a man of the soil. Now, this isn't exactly said of Adam in Genesis 2 or 3, but it's hard not to see a connection with Adam, particularly in light of the clear Adamic connections that we've already noted in the preceding chapters. In particular, Noah is the priestly head of a new humanity, and now he becomes a man of the soil, like his father Adam was the priestly head of the first humanity. He was a worker and keeper of the ground. And so Noah is being presented here once again as a as a second Adam, a new master of the earth. And in so becoming, he plants a vineyard. And so far, there's nothing particularly negative about this. Whereas Noah's ancestors seemingly raised basic produce for survival, bread and some plants to eat, Noah cultivates what Wenham calls a luxury item. It's a progression of sorts from what we've seen. And so we're told in verse 21 that he drank of the wine that he had cultivated. Still, nothing wrong. And then he became drunk. He uncovers himself and blacks out in his tent. Now we have a problem. Some have argued that there's not really any sin being attributed to Noah here at all. The text certainly doesn't explicitly condemn Noah's behavior. And admittedly, there are worse things you could do when intoxicated than to lay down in your own private dwelling, even if you're naked. And yet, while it's true that neither the Old Testament nor the New Testament condemns the production or enjoyment of alcohol as an absolute sin in and of itself, in fact, they both praise its benefits at different times. There are plenty of passages that warn against the overuse of alcohol, as well as a few passages that forbid it under certain circumstances altogether. Consider some of them with me. Positively, then, we have Psalm 104, verse 15. It says that wine gladdens the heart of man. Judges 9:13 tells a parable that goes so far as to say that wine cheers both men and God. In Zechariah 8:12 and Isaiah 25:6, both of these passages describe a future age with wine as a symbol of bliss under the Messiah's reign. Negatively, however, we have Proverbs 23, 29 through 35. It quite provocatively describes the dangers of those who tarry long over strong drink. Habakkuk 2:15 pronounces woe to the one who makes his neighbors drink in order to gaze at their nakedness. Lamentations 4:21 laments those who become drunk and strip themselves bare. Some outright prohibitions, and we see texts like Leviticus 10:9. It forbids those serving in the temple to drink. Numbers 6:2-4 forbids the use of alcohol in the connection with a special vow, the Nazirite vow. In Proverbs 31:4 and 5, we find a warning against using alcohol for those making decisions in leadership. And there are some other examples that we could give, but all of it to say is that alcohol is neither condemned nor forbidden in the Old Testament, nor in the New. Certainly not under all circumstances, but there are warnings attached to it, attached to its misuse. And drunkenly exposing oneself is expressly condemned in the Old Testament in other places. And so it's just not reasonable, really, to read this passage as some kind of commendatory or even neutral evaluation of Noah. He drinks wine to the point of such drunkenness that he disrobes and passes out in his tent. Rather than cultivating the ground for the productive advancement of God's kingdom, he cultivates it and is shamefully conquered by the fruit of his hands. And so even if he isn't intending to get drunk here, he unintentionally gets drunk, at the very least, failing to exercise the self-control required of humanity's faithful head, covenant head. He drinks to the point of intoxication and blacks out naked, exposing himself to the wiles of others and exposing his own need of a Savior. Right? Because up to this point, Noah is our guy. Noah is righteous, blameless in his generation. Maybe not sinless. We don't know. We're not described any sin on his part up to this point. And so here we see Noah, he needs a Savior like us. And what's more, his failure in this regard, it presents an opportunity for someone else. Ham in this case to be tempted to sin. And so that's the Noah angle. What about Ham? We're told that he sees his father's nakedness and then he tells his two brothers outside. Now, there are three basic and admittedly wildly distinct interpretations that have been offered in explanation of Ham's actions here. All of them are negative, but they are very different from one another. One is the idea that it is just what the text says. Ham saw Noah lying naked in his tent somehow, and then he told his brothers about it, likely ridiculing and humiliating their father. Second, he saw his naked father and committed some kind of sin against him, some kind of physical sin against his unconscious father, and then went and told his brothers about it. That's the second interpretation. A third would be that seeing a man's nakedness is a euphemism for engaging in a sexual union with the man's wife. In other words, Ham had an incestuous relationship with his own mother. Like I said, it's not for the faint of heart. Now, the Bible does use the phrase to uncover someone's nakedness euphemistically in this way in a few places, Leviticus 18 and 20 in particular. But Genesis 9 says that Ham saw his father's nakedness. Noah uncovered himself. So it's unlikely that we are to see these things as a direct parallel, that is what's taking place here. And so more or less that rules out the third interpretation. Furthermore, if Ham committed some physical act against Noah's wife or Noah himself, it's entirely unclear how Shem and Japheth's response to simply walk backward and cover up the nakedness of their father, it's not clear how that's an appropriate response or what that would even accomplish. And so that's very brief, but I don't find either of the latter two options that I named particularly satisfying. And I think they ultimately raise more questions than are answered. But the first explanation, that Ham saw his drunk, unconscious, naked father and then walked outside and derided him in front of his two brothers, it's most likely what the author intends to be understood. Now, in our particularly individualistic culture that cares little for family loyalty and generational ties, Noah's response to Ham's mockery might seem disproportional. But I would submit to you that is our problem and not the text. In other words, Ham's disrespect for and his dishonoring of his father is, in God's sight, an especially grievous offense. In fact, the fifth commandment requires the exact opposite of what Ham does in this moment. Right? The Bible never tells us exactly what you should do when your parents are utterly humiliating themselves. But it does tell us you shouldn't do this. And it does tell us in the fifth commandment that we are to honor our father and our mother. To say that disrespect for one's parents in the worldview of the Bible is a small sin would be a gross misreading of not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. And so Ham dishonors and ridicules his father, and he introduces a serious breach into this family. There's one more piece of the puzzle, one more angle to consider in these verses 20 through 23, and that's Shem and Japheth's reaction. They walk backward. Their faces are not looking at their father, and they cover up their father's nakedness. As I said, this is probably, I think, the best reason to conclude that Ham seeing his father's nakedness isn't meant euphemistically, but that he actually saw Noah's naked body and then told his brothers about it. Because the text goes to such lengths to tell us that they didn't see anything. They enter the tent backward, they cover him up, doing the best they can to honor their disgraced father. While Noah's decadence and Ham's utter moral abandon are each told in relatively brief, terse language, the narration slows down considerably to gaze upon Shem and Japheth's righteous action. Look at the discrepancy in length between verses 21, 22, and 23. 21, it just tells you the point. He drank of the wine, became drunk, lay uncovered in his tent. 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, told his brothers outside. Very little detail is given. Short, to the point. 23, much longer sentence. It's not even what's more than one sentence in English. It's much longer verse here, much longer description. Verses 21 and 22 are short, punchy statements. They depict the shortcomings and sin of Noah first and then his son second in very brief language. This is how the Bible often does with, again, seedy material. But verse 23, the righteous act of Shem and Japheth, it's long, it's repetitious, it's detailed. They took a garment, they laid it on both their shoulders. They walked backward, covered the nakedness of the father. Their faces were turned backward. They did not see their father's nakedness. The oldest son's attitude, we zoom in on it here because it's the exact opposite of the pride and the disrespect of their younger brother. They worked carefully to ensure that they did not dishonor their father, that they did not see his naked body. They labored not to see it. They labored not to see what they shouldn't see. They covered up his nakedness. And we have here something of an echo of Genesis 3. Think about it. Noah, man of the soil, conquered by the ground, winds up naked. Does that remind you of something? Adam and Eve. Adam, a worker, a keeper of the garden, the ground, conquered by the ground. And what happens when they eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What do they realize about themselves? They're naked. Now, Noah's failure doesn't lead to the realization that he's naked, so there is a difference. There are different words, Hebrew words used here, Noah's nakedness and theirs nakedness, but there is a similarity in these stories. Because what happens to Adam and Eve's nakedness? God covers it. What happens to Noah's nakedness? Well, first, his son, Ham, the anti-God, exposes it further. But Shem and Japheth imitate God, and they cover up the nakedness of their father. And I think this helps us to understand a bit more about Noah's disgrace and Ham's moral abandon. As I said, there are different Hebrew words used for the nakedness of Adam and Eve and the nakedness of Noah, and so it's not a direct linguistic parallel. But consider what has happened from Genesis, the end of Genesis 2, the man and the woman were naked and unashamed, to now a man lying naked in his tent. How has nakedness been transformed by sin in the world? It's been transformed by Genesis 3:7 and Genesis 9. Nakedness doesn't any longer mean purity and innocence, but it means danger, it means exposure and shame. Noah's nakedness mirrors, to some degree, Adam and Eve's nakedness and Ham's ridicule of him. It not only dishonors him as his father, but it makes light of the weakness, the exposure, the vulnerability, and the shame of the head of the new humanity that God has established. And so this is a dreadfully sad moment in human history. But let's consider thirdly Noah's declarations, verses 24 through 27. He wakes up, he comes to, and he learns somehow what his youngest son had done to him. And so he makes three pronouncements, one upon each of his sons, which ultimately the pronouncements are not exactly for them, but for their children and beyond. And he begins with Ham pronouncing a curse upon not Ham himself, but Canaan. And we're told multiple times in this passage before this moment, twice before this moment, that Ham is the father of Canaan. We are prepared for this moment, for this curse that Noah pronounces. And it's interesting because this, by my recollection, is the first time that anyone other than Yahweh does any cursing or blessing. Right? Blessings and curses are important in the book of Genesis. They're important in the Bible as a whole. But in truth, it is God only who can actually bless and actually curse. The blessings and the curses of men are simply expressions of expectation and hope in the action of God to bring about favor or misfortune upon the righteous or the wicked, respectively. Think about in Numbers 23 and following. What does Balaam make clear? It's impossible for him to extend a curse upon someone that God has blessed. A curse cannot repudiate the blessing of God. In fact, this is one reason that some have suggested that Noah curses Canaan rather than Ham directly. Right? Ham was blessed by God in Genesis 9:1. And so they say Noah would be unable to undo that blessing. But Ham's sin was so high-handed, so egregious, that there must be lasting consequences. And I think there's some weight to that, but perhaps more simply, Ham has introduced a division into Noah's family now, a breach. And so now a breach shall be introduced into Ham's, beginning with, again, it isn't just Canaan himself, but the people that will come from him. So let's consider the content of the verse. He says that Canaan is to be a servant of servants to his brothers. The most you could be a servant, an utter abject servitude, he will be to his brothers. And we see that come to fruition in part in a text like Judges 1:28. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. We see it also in part in 1 Kings 9:20 and 21. All the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all descendants of Canaan, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants, who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, those Solomon drafted to be slaves, and so they are to this day. And yet, there really isn't a time in the life of Israel that the Canaanites are completely subjected to Israel. There's large cities and things, and many of them are, but not totally. And so this curse, how it functions as a broad general imprecation against the families who would come from Canaan. Ross writes, the point of the story and context is God's preparation for the giving of the land to Abram, the heir of Shem's blessing. This point would then typify the preparation of the land for Israel's inheritance. For Israel to receive the blessing of the promise of the fathers, the curse on the Canaanites had to be exacted. But why Canaan? Ham had other sons or other children, right? Well, it may be due to God's blessing of Ham, is why he curses Canaan and not Ham, but why Canaan? Well, the Bible speaks of the sins of the father being visited upon the children in Exodus 20, verse 5. Well, the Bible also says that the son shall not be punished for the sins of the father in Ezekiel 18, 1-4. The one who sins shall die. So which is it? Does God punish children for the sins of the father, or does he not? Well, in Exodus 20, verse 5, we read that God punishes the sins of the father on the children to those who hate me. In other words, the children who emulate the sins of the father shall receive similar judgments as the father. a later generation may indeed be judged for the sins of an ancestor if they share in that ancestor's wicked traits. Now, even righteous generations later may endure bad fruit from the sins of an ancestor, but they are not explicitly judged for them. And so here in this passage, as with other blessings and curses in the Bible, we have to, in connection with other texts of the Bible, it's not said explicitly here, but it seems that Noah discerns in Canaan a similar characteristic or similar characteristics that are found in Ham. And this makes sense given what we know about the Canaanites in general as we read the rest of the Old Testament. In particular, consider a passage like Leviticus 18, 2-6. I won't read it now. You can read it on your own later. But that passage warns Israel against very specific sins that were prominent among the Canaanites. Vile practices, like the one that some commentators accuse Ham of doing, such vile practices in Leviticus 18 that the text must refer to some of them euphemistically. The Canaanites were enslaved by sexual deviance, even beyond what Ham had done. So they weren't cursed because of Ham, like specifically what he did alone, but they were cursed because they continued to do what he had done, and even more. As for the blessings of Shem and Japheth, Noah blesses Shem and his descendants first, though interestingly, he blesses not Shem directly, but Shem's God, the covenant Lord, Yahweh. And then he says that Canaan would be Shem's servant. And then he blesses Japheth and his descendants with an expectation that God would enlarge him and let his descendants dwell in the tents of Shem, therefore making the Canaanites to be their servants as well. The cursing and blessing are central in this passage. The curse of Canaan is a bit more prominent. Canaan's descendants are doomed to perpetual slavery because they, like he, would be emulators of Ham's wicked character and behavior. Shem and Japheth's descendants would experience blessings, however, to the degree that they emulated their father's character and behavior. In particular, Shem's line would be blessed with covenant knowledge of the Lord. As we'll see, they are the chosen line through whom the promised seed would come. Japheth's line would have some temporary blessings and opportunity for more to the extent that they continued on peacefully with the Shemites. And so that's the declarations of Noah. We come fourthly and finally to his death. And it brings this section, the generations of Noah, to a close. And I don't really think there's much to say about it other than really just to restate the point that we had made back in chapter 5. The curse is still with us. God's promise, however, it continues to be relevant, but we saw Adam die. We saw his son Seth die. We saw his son die, and his son die. On and on. They all died. And now here we have Noah, the head of a new humanity. And despite his righteous character, despite his blameless comparison with all those who among whom he had lived prior to the flood, despite the fact that God had showed him favor, he is no capital S Savior. He is, as his father Adam was, conquered by the ground, and to it he also must return. And so let me close here with a few lessons that we learn from this section of Genesis as a whole in 6 through 9. The first is that the Lord hates sin. We saw at the beginning of chapter 6 that the Lord vowed to destroy all land dwellers because of the great sin that had spread on the earth in those days when the sons of God had children with the daughters of man. And whatever you think of the specifics of the sins that precipitated the flood there in chapter 6, it is clear that there are boundaries being crossed, that God had established. Boundaries are being crossed. In short and condensed form, that's what sin is at its heart. Crossing boundaries, violating God's law, either by not doing what he has required or by doing what he has forbidden. And the message of Genesis so far is that God hates sin, and He judges it, and it brings about death. And that message is not likely to change as we progress through this book. And it's bad news, secondly, a second lesson to draw from this section in Genesis. It's bad news that God hates sin because we are sinners and that man is exceedingly wicked. Twice in this narrative, in Genesis 6 and in Genesis 8, we read two versions of the same truth. Man is fundamentally, now on this side of Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, we are essentially totally depraved and, in a manner of speaking, thinking of evil constantly from our youth. We are at enmity with God, and we are set against Him and His kingdom purposes in the world. We've seen great sins ever since Genesis 3. We saw the sin in the garden. We saw Cain's wicked offering and his murder of his brother Abel. We saw Lamech marry two women. He killed a man and sang a song about it. We saw the abominable intermarriages that took place in Genesis 6. Now, righteous Noah gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent, and his son sees it and gossips about him. And he ridicules his father in front of his other sons, and it brings about division that will last for generations. And frankly, there are even more troubling things to come in this book. Genesis teaches us that because of sin, the world is a dark place. It's a dangerous place, and at times a disgusting place. And so it should prompt in us a sense of dread as humans, because God hates sin and He judges it, and we are full of it. However, this section of Genesis also tells us that there is still good news to be found. God is gracious. He keeps His promises. Right here, Noah prophetically declares that God despises the wicked, but He blesses the righteous. And in particular, it is His blessing of Shem that stands forth for us to see, as we will see in the coming chapters. We don't really see it until Genesis 11, where the line of Shem brings us to Terah, and Terah brings us to Abram. But even with Noah's failure, even with Ham's great sin, there is still hope that the blessed Yahweh would come to Shem. And He does. And it brings us to a final lesson. We look at Noah, all said and done. And we're not dunking on Noah, but we must look elsewhere for salvation. In many ways, Noah for sure was an exemplary and imitable character, but he failed to bring about the harmony between God and man. He failed to bring about peace on earth. He failed to establish a faithful humanity. I disagree with assessments that deny that Noah sinned at all in this narrative. But I certainly don't see the text as a whole holding him up as a paragon of vice either. He's a righteous and a virtuous man. But a virtuous man, lowercase v, is not going to be enough. Our estrangement from God, our exile from His benevolent presence, isn't going to be remedied by a good man. A decent, generally upright, comparatively blameless individual cannot stand the gap. And so we come, as always, to Jesus Christ. Interestingly, Canaan is cursed to be the servant of servants. But isn't it Jesus who becomes the servant of servants, who gives his life as a ransom for many. It's not Noah. It's not even Shem who is. Shem's not the faithful man. It's not Shem's line ultimately that does what needs to be done to bring about God's blessings on the earth. It is only in the sense that it is Jesus Christ who does so. He is the faithful human. Jesus is the one who brought peace and forever salvation by his righteous life and atoning death. And Jesus transforms bread and wine. Right, think about it. Bread in Genesis 3 and beyond is needed for sustenance. Right? It is necessary, and yet we obtain it only through toil. Wine, it's a luxury item, a luxurious elixir fraught with danger. He transforms that too. The bread and the wine now no longer symbols of sustenance through toil or luxury with danger alone, but they are in the gospel given to God's people as symbols of a broken body and shed blood. And so, we're coming to the table now, and as we do, I pray that each and every one of us would look to Jesus Christ and live.